You've seen Braveheart. You know William Wallace. But do you know his nemesis, the man history calls the Hammer of the Scots? He was a 6-foot 2-inch giant, a medieval tyrant who invented new forms of public torture, slaughtered thousands, and ethnically cleansed an entire people from his realm. But here's the twist. This same man was a legal genius who laid the foundations for the modern parliament. So, was he a saint or a devil? The story of King Edward I, Longshanks, isn't black and white. It's drenched in blood, and it all started not with glory, but with shame. Edward was born into chaos. His father, King Henry III, was a pious man and a terrible king. He was weak, indecisive, and constantly pushed around by his own barons. Edward grew up watching his father fail, watching England crumble into civil war. He swore one thing: he would never be weak. When the barons, led by the charismatic Simon de Montfort, finally went to war, Edward did the unthinkable. He briefly sided with the rebels against his own father. But when the Second Barons' War truly erupted, Edward became his father's ruthless champion. He was defeated and captured at the Battle of Lewes, watching as de Montfort ruled England like an uncrowned king. But Edward escaped, and this time he returned not for a battle, but for a mutilation. At the Battle of Evesham, he hunted de Montfort. It was a massacre. De Montfort was killed, his body hacked to pieces, and his head sent to a supporter's wife as a gruesome trophy. Edward had saved his father's crown, but he had shown the world the monster within. With England temporarily pacified, this warrior king needed a new war. He left his aging father and went on crusade to the Holy Land. But this was no glorious quest. The French army, his main allies, turned back. Edward, dangerously stubborn, pressed on with his small force, achieving little, except for attracting the wrong kind of attention. One night, an assassin snuck into his chambers. Edward, using his immense strength, fought him off and killed him, but not before he was stabbed with a poisoned dagger. As the poison and fever took hold, legend says his devoted wife, Eleanor of Castile, knelt by his bed and sucked the venom from the wound, saving his life. While recovering, news arrived. His weak father, Henry III, was dead. Edward was now King of England. But he didn't rush home. He took almost 2 years to return, slowly making his way through Europe. He was planning. He was calculating. And when he finally landed, England was about to meet a very different kind of king. His first target? Wales. For years, the Welsh princes, Llewellyn ap Gruffudd and his brother Dafydd, had defied English rule. Edward considered this a personal insult. He didn't just invade, he unleashed a systematic campaign of annihilation. In 1277, he forced Llewellyn to submit. When the Welsh rose up again 5 years later, Edward showed no mercy. Llewellyn was hunted down, his head cut off, and paraded through the streets of London, where it was impaled on a spike at the Tower. But for Dafydd, the last to stand, Edward decided a simple death was too kind. He wanted to make an example. So Edward invented a new form of execution, one designed to be the most horrific public spectacle imaginable: hanged, drawn, and quartered. Dafydd was tied to a horse and dragged through the streets. He was hanged, but cut down while still alive. Then, his belly was sliced open, his entrails pulled out and burned before his own eyes. Finally, he was beheaded, and his body was chopped into 4 pieces. It was a message. This is the fate of those who defy Edward. To ensure Wales would never rise again, he built his Iron Ring, a chain of massive stone castles. He didn't just conquer Wales, he choked it into submission. These wars were expensive, but Edward was just as much a genius of administration as he was of brutality. He needed money. So, he revolutionized the English government. He summoned what became the Model Parliament, bringing not just lords but also common knights and townspeople to Westminster. Don't mistake this for democracy. Edward called them for one reason: it was the most efficient way to get taxes. He made a revolutionary bargain. You give me your money, and I will listen to your problems. But he also found a quicker, darker source of cash. In 1290, to seize all their property, cancel his debts, and win favor with his barons, Edward issued the Edict of Expulsion. He expelled every single Jewish man, woman, and child from the Kingdom of England. It was the first nationwide, state-sponsored expulsion of Jews in European history. It was a brutal act of ethnic cleansing, all for financial gain. With Wales crushed and his treasury full, fate handed Edward his next prize, Scotland. The King of Scotland died in a freak accident, leaving no clear heir. The country spiraled toward civil war. The Scottish lords, in a moment of desperation, made a fatal mistake. They asked King Edward I to be their judge. It was like asking a wolf to guard the sheep. Edward agreed, but with one condition. Every claimant had to first recognize him publicly as the overlord of Scotland. Trapped, they agreed. Edward eventually chose a man named John Balliol, assuming he would be a weak, obedient puppet. He was wrong. Edward pushed too far, humiliating Balliol, treating him like a servant. The final straw came when Edward demanded Scottish troops fight for him in a new war against France. Balliol refused. Instead, he signed a treaty with France, the Auld Alliance. For Edward, this was the ultimate betrayal. In 1296, his patience snapped. He was no longer a judge. He was an invader. He marched his army to the Scottish border town of Berwick. The town resisted. Edward, in a cold rage, ordered an all-out assault. It wasn't a battle. It was a massacre. Thousands of men, women, and children were slaughtered. The streets ran red with blood. He smashed the Scottish army, captured King John, and ripped the crown from his head. Then, to destroy their very identity, he stole their most sacred object, the Stone of Scone, the ancient coronation stone of all Scottish kings. He dragged it back to London and built it into his own throne. He left, believing Scotland was broken, a leaderless land. He was wrong. Oppression doesn't crush nations. It forges them. And from the ashes of Berwick, a new leader emerged. A man from the lesser nobility, with a burning desire for vengeance. His name was William Wallace. While Edward was busy fighting in France, Wallace and a guerrilla army did the impossible. At the Battle of Stirling Bridge, they faced a massive, heavily armored English army. The English, arrogant, tried to cross a narrow bridge. Wallace waited. He let half the army cross, and then he sprung the trap. The English were slaughtered, caught on the bridge, and drowned in the river. It was a humiliating, stunning defeat for England. Edward was in a rage. He returned to England, assembled a terrifying army, and marched north himself. At the Battle of Falkirk, he met Wallace. Wallace used his skiltrons, tight circles of men with long spears, like giant hedgehogs. The English cavalry charged and were impaled. But Edward had a secret weapon. The thousands of Welsh longbowmen he had conquered. He ordered them to fire. It was a new kind of warfare. The arrows rained down, a storm of steel that cut the Scottish spearmen to pieces from a distance. Wallace's army was shattered. He escaped, but he was now a hunted man. For years, Wallace hid, but in 1305, he was betrayed and dragged to London. Edward wanted to make an example. Wallace was hanged, drawn, and quartered, his head impaled on London Bridge. Edward thought he was killing a rebel. Instead, he created a martyr. Just months later, Robert the Bruce, the rival claimant, made his move. He met his main rival, John Comyn, in a church. They argued, and Bruce stabbed him to death, right on the altar. It was murder and sacrilege. There was no turning back. Weeks later, Robert the Bruce was crowned King of Scots, and the war was on again. When the news reached Edward, the old king was beside himself with fury. He was now 68 years old, sick, dying from dysentery, but his will was pure iron. He ordered one last invasion. He was so weak he had to be strapped to his horse, but he would be at the head of his army. He would personally oversee the destruction of Robert the Bruce. He never made it. On July 7th, 1307, King Edward I, Longshanks, the Hammer of the Scots, died in a tent, just in sight of the Scottish border he had spent his life trying to erase. He left his son, Edward II, an unwinnable war. 7 years later, at the Battle of Bannockburn, Robert the Bruce led the Scots to a shattering, decisive victory, securing their independence for centuries. So who was Edward I? He was a monster, He was a genius. He was a legal visionary who built the English state, and a brutal tyrant who slaughtered his neighbors. He was the Hammer of the Scots, and in his relentless, brutal obsession to destroy a nation, he accidentally and unknowingly forged it forever. What do you think? Was Edward I one of England's greatest kings, or its most notorious war criminal? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories of history's most complex and terrifying figures, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell.